your family farm's future uncertain? Silence may be the biggest risk of all. Discover how open conversations and gradual planning can secure your legacy and empower the next generation. Don't wait, start the dialogue today. Learn more and download a transition planning checklist at fcc.ca/knowledge.
Thanks to our show sponsors, the Soil School, Black Earth, and MNP. With deep roots in agriculture, MNP helps farm businesses make confident financial decisions. From planning to growth, their advisors are here to support your success. Learn more at mmp.ca. Hey everyone, welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. Thank you so much for your patience tonight as we get things rolling. We still might be short one guest, but you know what? We're just going to roll with it because that's how it goes. And thank you to everyone in the comments for your love and support at this difficult time. Really appreciate it. And yes, thanks to producer Jay for that great new music. Looking forward to hearing all of it next week. But trying very hard to stay as close to on time as possible. Tonight, super excited to have this conversation about phosphorus and phosphorus use efficiency. Definitely a big question when it comes to those fertility decisions each year. Before we jump to our conversation though, a reminder, if you collect those CU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you took in the show. We'll get you all signed up for your credits. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter to remind you of upcoming episodes and to deliver past episodes and frankly some news that maybe you can use every Wednesday into your inbox. And I did want to, before I forget, next week we are going to talk grain drying. So as people have been sharing, it has been kind of a wild week for Western Canada. Lots of water, maybe too much water. Finally some rain here in Ontario. But for those of us in the East, we actually got frost for Friday and Saturday night, and then Sunday was 26 degrees. That's Celsius. My guests are from America, so I'll have to convert for them. But there you go. It's been a little bit wild. And no, Mark, there were no woolly pigs chewing wires here tonight. But we're here. And so let's bring in our guest for tonight so far, unless Andrew has managed to join, Dan Kaiser from the University of Minnesota. Dan, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us. We're hoping Andrew will still be able to hop on any moment now, but we'll just keep rolling. We don't want to keep our fans waiting, of course. Dan, tell us a little bit about what you do there in Minnesota. What kind of crops do you work on? What keeps you busy in a week like this week?
So my position in Minnesota, I am the nutrient management specialist, extension soil scientist that deals with fertilizer recommendations for the state of Minnesota. So I work with a lot of crops across the state, and that's one of the things that it's been interesting. I came from Iowa, moved to Minnesota. That's where I did all my my research work down in Iowa. So it's been a little bit of a learning experience just because of the change in crop rotation up here. Since we deal with more small grains than I dealt with in Iowa, some other crops. I do some work on sugar beets, corn, soybean are my main when it comes to some of the crops. And then a little bit on spring wheat. We haven't done as much, some rye work, dry edible beans. And about the only thing that I haven't done a lot of work with here in Minnesota, although we do get into some work up in the far northwest, is canola. It's one of the things that, they're just... The acreage isn't as much, and based on where it is, there's a lot more work done in North Dakota. So there's always been kind of a joint relationship between us and North Dakota, with especially where North Dakota State University is right on the border, that they do a lot of work up in the northwest part of the state. So unfortunately, you asked me some questions on that. I don't necessarily always give a straight answer on it because this is one of the issues with it, because it's one of the crops that I don't work on. But I keep busy. A lot of the work I've been doing mainly focused on phosphorus, potassium, a lot of work on sulfur, not as much on nitrogen. We've got it's one of the things that I am lucky here in the state of Minnesota that there were some investments made a few years back by the state and the university and bringing more nutrient management specialists in. So we've got a lot of people covering a lot of areas, which is good because it's a pretty big state. And that's really what's challenging here. I'm located out of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so to get up to some of our northern locations, it's about 4.5, 5 hour drive. So it's one of the things that takes a team effort here in Minnesota, and that's kind of what we've tried to build here with amongst of all of our researchers, is try to make it more of a team so we can get more done.
Certainly similarities, I would say, between, let's say, some of our Western provinces, even Ontario. I'm a solid 5.5 hour drive from just the middle of Ontario. So same idea. We've got a lot of ground to cover, literally, when it comes to some of these decisions and the differences that can happen between soil types, weather patterns, etc. Definitely want to, and exactly why you're here on this phosphorus question. There's a couple different angles that obviously we want to take with phosphorus. There is an environmental question, there is a crop production question, and there's an economic question on phosphorus. In that it is one of those ones that you can maintain, you can draw down, you can build. Looking at it from where you are, so in Minnesota, but thinking back to your Iowa experience as well, when crop prices aren't maybe the best, when profitability is a bit under pressure, and I'm being generous here when I say a bit, is phosphorus one of the ones that farmers often are like, let's just pull that way back? How do you handle that sort of discussion?
Well, it's one of the things that's nice here in Minnesota is that we've got a pretty varied set of soils. So if I look at kind of what I deal with here is I've got soils in the southern and southeastern part of the state that are more like kind of our central corn belt here in the U.S. And then I've got soils that are like the Great Plains. So it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy across even the state here. And that's one thing I like because it makes it somewhat challenging and I see different results with it. And one of the things with phosphorus, it's interesting to me. I mean, if you look at growers' attitudes towards where they cut, it's not always one that I always see them think about cutting back on, because if you look at historically, my predecessors here in the States, they did a really good job of selling fertilizer to a lot of these growers, especially in some of these fields. The phosphorus soil test is far more solid when it comes to predicting the availability versus some of our other soil tests. So it's one of the ones that I think it's probably the easiest to cut back, but it's interesting to me. I know a few consultants across the state, and they work with a lot of their growers, and just a lot of their comments, sitting down with their growers, making a plan of what they're going to do, and then by the time the grower goes to the retailer always seems to be able to talk them into a few more pounds. And I think we can talk about this in the when it comes to the use efficiency piece, is that when I look at phosphorus, being close is generally good enough. You don't have to hit. There's really not just a bullseye you have to hit in terms of management with the majority of our soils, because the soil isn't devoid of it. It has some there. And that really, again, boils down to efficiency. And what I've tried to do here in the state of Minnesota with our recommendations, we were more conservative when it comes to the recommendations when I came in. I've tried to offer some different options to growers, because I know a lot of them, they weren't really necessarily following some of what we're doing. So what I've generally taken the whole strategy is just lay things out in front of them and say, well, you've got to make the decision for your operation. Here's what I see. Here's the things to look at kind of for decision tools and what you can use.
So, and Mark's got a question here on purchase fertility program versus a manure fertility program, and how some of these things weigh out. So let's back up a step. Most of us, I think, understand how phosphorus acts in the soil, but I think it's always good to review. And so you mentioned sort of that, there's that legacy piece of understanding that there is some phosphorus in the soil that will become available, and we can actually sort of bank that, or we can draw down that bank account. So when we're thinking, let's look at, we can work in a manure program, but from a fertility program, I think it's interesting you say, soil testing gives us maybe more assurance of an actual response. But how do we sort of view that question of whether we maintain, draw down, or build up?
Well, a lot of it's really grower attitudes. I mean, look at essentially if you got all your growers out there, the ones that are watching this, I mean, you've got a lot of things to consider when it comes to the overall management. If there's something out there that's easy to maintain that you don't have to think about and make it simple, and kind of hit that easy button. I mean, that's kind of where a lot of this P and K, I think, when it comes to both phosphorus and potassium, comes into play because it's something you don't have to think about. It's kind of that insurance policy that it should be near max yield, and a lot of them are going to err towards that just because, again, in the past, we've seen the benefits. I mean, I know my dad started farming back around 1960, and that was one of the things he said. I mean, when you looked at kind of where they were at for fertility programs back then, you saw the value of it. So you just kind of stick with that same over time because it's just what you know. What I've really been trying to stress to a lot of growers is, especially with fertilizer, that being close again is really more critical. I mean, if you have manure, it's a whole different strategy. I mean, then your situation where you get into situations where you can build up to extremely high levels. But what I've been trying to lay out for a lot of our growers is, kind of where's that point if you're looking at trying to manage around, where do you want to stick at? Because I think that's the key, is to knowing kind of where you start getting above a point where the probability of response is extremely low, where it doesn't really agronomically make sense to apply fertilizer. If you want to manage around that point, that's fine, but just don't get your soil tests that high because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's
Right.
really the big thing, is to try to just kind of pick a range and kind of stick in with it, but also know that we have some flexibility. So say MAP and DAP prices are high, which for us they are right
Yep.
now. Maybe you can cut back a certain percentage and still be fine. And that's some of the things I've looked at, actually. I mean, I've been here in Minnesota for 17 years, and that was some of the projects that I've looked at, essentially, is that build up drawdown and kind of what it actually takes to maintain in a corn soybean rotation. That's kind of been one of the key pieces that I'll probably be talking about here this summer. Again, I'll just be trying to hammer that home, is
Yeah.
that if you are soil testing, just take advantage of it right now. I mean, that's really the best thing you can do, and try to look at putting your inputs to where it makes more sense, because if you're looking at these high prices, it's about the best you can do.
So on that note, and that this is one of those ones where the timing of some of these fertilizer applications really matters. We know we need phosphorus early. We know we need it close to the seed for a lot of our crops. If we're in a situation where fertility costs are very high, but we've got really decent phosphorus levels, let's say they're in that medium high, this question comes up quite often, is do you still put down some phosphorus at seeding?
So, I mean, that's one of the things that you look at, like a lot of our recommendations right now. I mean, even in the high and the very high, we do recommend maybe some starter applications, because we do realize that, I mean, there's some crops out there that might benefit from it, or you may have some reduced tillage situations where it might be worth doing it. And with small grains, I mean, our one, and then corn is really the big two, I would say, here in Minnesota, that I would just suggest. Well, sugar beets are another one too. That's kind of three, because we actually see situations where a small amount of liquid is just about as good as a large amount of broadcast for beets. So, I mean, it's just knowing what crops are really the best option. So there's something there. I mean, the big thing that I looked at, and one of the things that I've seen, is that, I had a lot of fields. This is back around right when I first started, around 2010. We were doing some studies, and we did them over a 10-year period, and about 3 locations across Minnesota. And what really I was trying to look at is what it took to maintain, in terms of percentage of removal, my soil test over time. And most of these sites, we started in a medium to high category. And, I was looking at a corn soybean rotation, putting on about 40% of what that crop removed annually, and still be able to maintain my soil test. So that's not going to work for everybody. I mean, there's certainly some soils out there, especially if you get into situations where we deal with in the western part of the state with higher soil pHs that tend to, I would say really eat, but it tends to react with the phosphorus, where you get a lot of calcium bound, where it reduces availability. I mean, it's going to be different there. But the thing about a lot of those soils, even with the higher prices, it's a lot easier to pencil it out, because the return on investment from phosphorus is much higher per pound on that. And really, the big thing I can tell a lot of growers is, the thing that I'm seeing sneaking in, especially more questions here in the last 6 months, has been alternative sources. We've got the Struvite product, which if Andrew was on, he talk a little bit about that, because he's done some work with that, Crystal Green. And then we've got a few other
Yeah.
products that's been an interesting, because I've been starting to hear things about, I mean, a lot of our question from this fall is a lot of the growers have been supply. Is, whether some of the
Okay.
retailers are actually going to have some that they're going to be able to get some phosphorus. So everybody's looking for an alternative strategy. And then the other thing I've been hearing a lot is alternatives for some of the liquids, because we use a lot of 1034O for starter fertilizer programs. And I'm starting to see more low salt sources sneak in. The big thing on phosphorus is, what I look at with a lot of this stuff is how much you're paying per unit nutrient. And that's the thing that you
Right.
really need to look at is, some of these that they're claiming higher efficiency. I'm not really a bigger proponent of some of this higher efficiency things that, you just got to pencil it out and see how much you're paying per pound, because, even some of the higher price stuff still may make more sense in the end, just because you're not getting enough of the product really to make a difference. So it's been kind of the big thing sneaking in has been, we see these higher prices. We see a lot of these specialty products come out of the market, these fertilizer additives, and then also some of these enhanced efficiency phosphorus sources, which we don't just see a lot of positive data with. So it's a thing that worries me slightly from some of these growers is overspending in some of those areas when you're probably just better off, cutting back and still using kind of the tried and true products that you've used over time.
So, and that is a really good point on availability. Usually we have that conversation about nitrogen, and everybody gets really fuzzed up about nitrogen being in place when we need it, etc., which may still be an issue for this fall or spring as well. But it's definitely a question for all of these products, and certainly not the first we've heard this fall already of potentially making sure you're having those conversations with your ag retail early on what product you may want to have in place. So is that on the radar already quite a bit for in your area?
Oh yeah, I mean I think that's the big thing is talking to growers. I mean, it's hard to get a read on this too, because I'm assuming there's some in terms of how things are prioritized and how some of these retailers and what they're carrying. And what I've seen a big shift in the last 15 years, essentially, with some of the products like the Micro Essentials line is, one of the major shifts I've seen are retailers carrying some of those products. But, you get into some of those situations where the cost per unit nutrient is higher. The question is it really worth it if you're getting the benefit out of everything else that's in there? So I think that's where a lot of growers are going to be kind of even. We'll see. I mean, I'll see this, when the fertilizer applicators start going, we should start seeing that here pretty soon, because soybeans will start coming off here. Seeing, if there are any issues at that point in terms of getting a supply of any of these nutrients. So time will tell. I mean, it's been, just with the high prices, I was kind of hoping we'd see some drop in some of the prices, and we did see that with potash, but with phosphate, that's going to be problematic, I think, here, just based on supply.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we are. I've got words. We think we've got Andrew lined up to join, which is great because I've got some questions for him as well. But we are going to go, producer Jay, if you would, let's go to. We talked about sort of that, being able to depend on a response and how we can make that call. So producer Jay, if you would, we'll go to, it's a clip with Jeremy Boychin, a wheat school, predicting a response in wheat. We'll hop to that, and then hopefully we'll have Andrew on when we come back.
Hopefully, all of the farmers have either planned to or have already taken soil samples for this year. We really want to get an idea of what we're working with in the soil for not just nitrogen, but phosphorus and potassium. Now, we know that phosphorus and potassium won't be changing as much as we're dealing with nitrogen, but it's still an important factor and something for us to consider when we're looking to maximize our yield potential, because we know that depending on the amount of phosphorus and potassium in the soil, our yield response of that wheat crop is going to change. And also, it's going to play a role in how we are managing our long-term phosphorus and potassium plan. Because phosphorus and potassium, they take a little bit more time to manage, and typically we want to look at a longer time scale, more specifically at phosphorus. So when we think about phosphorus and we're putting down phosphorus with our wheat seed, and we get that soil test back and it tells us, okay, Mr. Farmer, we have 20 pounds of phosphorus soil. What does that mean for my application? What does that mean in terms of yield response? And we know, based on research done by Ross McKenzie and Alberta Ag historically, that there are yield responses that we can expect from phosphorus application based on our soil test phosphorus. Now remember, Kelowna is the soil test method we want for phosphorus in Alberta. That's what all of our recommendations are on. So if you're getting soil tests done, looking at phosphorus, make sure you're looking at the Kelowna soil test for phosphorus. So when we get those numbers back, based on what we get, we can get an idea of, if I put phosphorus down, am I or am I not likely to see a yield response? So with the medium to low range of phosphorus, which is 50 pounds of phosphorus in the soil, so 25 ppm or less, we have a 60 to 100% chance of seeing a yield response. So this is going to cover a lot of the soils in Alberta, Western Canada. A lot of them are in that medium to low range. But if you're in the soil test range of 50 pounds or greater, or 25 ppm or greater, the likelihood of seeing a response is in that 30 to 50% range.
Our sponsors tonight are the Soil School, MNP, and Black Earth. Black Earth offers a full suite of humic solutions, from high purity granules to powder, liquid, and soluble formulations, all powered by pure humulate. Trusted by growers worldwide from one of the world's rarest humulate reserves. Grow stronger with the power of Black Earth Humulate. Learn more from mine to market. Visit blackearth.com. All right, we are back. Andrew is here. Andrew, can you hear us? And can we hear you? Oh, goodness. Okay. Hang on. We'll work on sound. I can't hear you. Jay, is he muted? Producer Jay?
How about this? Is this better?
Oh, there we go. That's better. Okay. We're good. Andrew, Dan. Okay.
Awesome.
Yes. Okay, Andrew. So we have covered off a good discussion on sort of the economic considerations for sure on the, when margins are tight, do you draw down, do you build, do you hold? And Dan's done a great job of outlining some of those points. I want to give you a few seconds here to introduce yourself, of course, and the work that you're doing at the University of Illinois. And I want to jump right into, when we are doing our phosphorus soil tests, making sure we're using the right one, because we've got a question about that and the clip mentions that as well. But Andrew, take it away. Let us know about what you're working on.
Sure. Thanks, Lyndsey. So first, thanks for having me, and my apologies for being a latecomer to the game here. I two little ones distracted me. Yeah. So
we're good.
I'm Andrew. Yeah. I'm an associate professor at the U of I at Urbana-Champaign. I've been here for about 8 years now. I work on nutrients and nutrient cycling, losses, and one of the big focuses of my group is on phosphorus. And so we look at phosphorus all the way from the mechanisms on how does biology of soils influence the cycling of P, to the fixation that we hear about. Well, what exactly is fixation? Can we try to prevent that? And then all the way up to more applied scales. So things like, what's the right critical value for a soil test for P in a certain soil type in Illinois? So from basic to applied work.
Yes. Okay. Now, so one of the things, and we've got some good slides as well that I want to draw from, but in that video clip, Jeremy Boychin mentioned that if you're in Alberta, you're using a Kelowna test. There are several different ones. So Dan, for you, what phosphorus soil test values, what test is most common, or the one you should be looking at for where you are?
So we're typically running either the Bray P1 for on most of our acidic soils, or the Olson. So that's kind of pretty common for most of the Midwest. Andrew will have some differences. There's another one, the Malick 3 test, that a lot of labs use, a lot of states use. We haven't adopted it yet. And really, about the soil tests themselves, the main thing I can see, as long as they're correlated and properly calibrated, I mean, it really doesn't matter what you use, because the soil test itself is an index of availability. So it really just tells you what relative availability of the nutrient is in the soil. So as long as it's predictive of crop response, some people get hung up on certain tests. I mean, some of the labs do with the Malick 3 because it's a lot easier for them to do and for high throughput. So that's kind of what we do. Okay. But I mean, again, that's the two we use, Bray and the Olson.
Okay. And Andrew, for you, is that what soil test do you use for it? And are there major differences, or what do we keep in mind as Dan has outlined?
Well, as Dan said, we're not as alkaline as some parts of Minnesota are, so we don't use Olsen in Illinois. You could use it. Some people find decent calibrations between Olsen P and yield responsiveness, which is the whole point of these tests, right? It's not measuring available, it's measuring responsiveness of yield to more P additions. So a bit down south where we are, we're typically circumneutral pHs. So the more appropriate test that we've been using as a state for decades now is the Bray test. And now Melic is really replacing it. Lots of commercial labs will just convert the Melic value to the Bray value, but some labs still do the original wet chemistry of the Bray, also called the P1 test.
Okay. All right. So the important thing to know, though, is know which test you have and how to interpret it. That's the most important part, right, Dan?
Well, yeah, and it's also just to recognize the fact that, I mean, when you're extracting phosphorus, you're extracting from different pools in the soil. So, like the Olsen will measure more of kind of the better than some of the calcium bound fraction. The Bray does better when you've got more iron and aluminum bound phosphorus. So you can't use the numbers themselves interchangeably. And like for us in Minnesota, we use part per million, which is about essentially you take pounds per acre divided by 2. That would be ppm, and it's mainly because a lot of states shifted to that. Other than Illinois, I mean, they're still in pounds per acre, about one of the only ones around. But it was mainly just it made sense to growers because you're applying pounds, you have in pounds per acre. But I mean, it's all so you said just don't use, if you take your number that you might have in the tests you're running in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, any of those areas, don't take and compare them to the numbers I have in my tables, because my tables are in a different format. And that's the main thing. You just got to know what you're looking at.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That sounds great. Okay. Gord's got a great question. And Andrew, I'll go to, and this is really about soil type and soil phosphorus levels. And this maybe gets into some of this fixation or fixing, which is different than end fixing. But Gord asks, how much does the target soil P level vary by soil type? Andrew, how would you handle that question?
I think it might depend on how one defines soil type, right? If it's a specific soil series, then by and large, if the calibrations have been done for soil types that fall in that exact series or soil type, then you should be good. I think that the way to think about this is that think or find out what the calibrations have been based on. So if we know that you want to be at, say, for Melic for us, around 25 ppm for Illinois or 50 pounds per acre, then keep in mind that that's specific to certain soil types. I'm going to counter that question and say I would do your own zero check strip. So compare the relative yield with and without P, and that gives you a customized recommendation for your specific field. So going beyond to soil type, things like legacy P, the pH, there's enough factors beyond soil type that can influence what the appropriate level is response-wise for yield, that I'm not sure soil type itself is as helpful as the exact field in question.
Okay, so I love the idea of doing a zero test strip. Some people on this call are going to do that. And I love that about all those people who are. Please share your results because we like to know about them. Now, but there's a lot of people that won't. I think taking that question maybe a different way, which and I like how we look at this from different angles. Is there, or are there things we need to know about how phosphorus acts in, say, a sandy versus a loamy versus a clay soil? Andrew, I'll go to you and then to you, Dan, because I'm sure you deal with some lovely clay soils. So are there any sort of rules of thumb we need to know about phosphorus if we just put them into those broad categories?
Sure, I'd say maybe 3 things. So one would be vertical movement. We're often told that P doesn't really leach or move like nitrate. It does, it's just a lot more slow. And this really comes out in super sandy soils. So if you're on sandy flats like in Kankakee in Illinois or the Wisconsinian flats, then yeah, P can leach vertically. It's not as much as nitrate pound per acre, not as fast, but it is going to move. Second thing is fixation, as you pointed out. That's a combination of of pH and the mineralogy. And I want to point out that fixation is a pretty rough concept. It makes sense big picture, but it kind of falls apart on the fine scale chemistry. But in general, if you're very acidic, under 5.5 pH, you can expect aluminium fixation. Iron fixation does not kick in till under 4.5, which we often don't think about. It's really AL that's the problem. That's why, that is why in Brazil they lime up to pH 5.5 because that's the target by which they reduce AL binding up P. And then if you're in high pH above 7.5 into the 8s, like where Dan might be, then you've got calcium fixation, which is more of a precipitation. The third factor would be how much organic matter there might be could be of relevance insofar as we know that there's some contribution of organic phosphorus, like there is from organic nitrogen. It can mineralize during the growing season. The problem is that unlike for N, we've got a poor grasp on that for N. For P, it's even poorer. So there's some amount. I certainly would not want to make recommendations, but I pointed out because if you've got the same soil type and you see different responses on your check strip compared to the with P strip, it might be in part due to not just pH, but also organic phosphorus credits.
So Dan, let's unpack that a little bit as well, is because Mark's got a great question here about CEC as well. So when we think about phosphorus in the soil, when we think about organic matter or clay, et cetera, like how do we, or is there a way we could think about phosphorus a little bit differently in these soils from a management perspective?
So this is a good question, and this is something I deal with quite a bit because if you look at kind of where I'm at, we've got calcium-bound phosphorus being an issue in the western part of the state versus some of the more acidic parts in the eastern part of the state, yet we still don't really make any distinction in terms of a critical level, in terms of a target build point across our state because I don't have any data to do so. And that's kind of the main thing that's why if I run a study, I'll run a study in southeastern Minnesota. I'll do south central, southwest, west central, northwest, where we have differences across all our different soil types. And just to try to see whether or not there is a difference in the probability response. I mean, if there is for us, I think it's so small that it really doesn't matter as much. Because if we look at when it comes to soil testing, there's a certain amount of uncertainty when it comes to soil testing. So if I take a sample, I take, say, 15 cores, or if I take 5 cores, I'm going to have more uncertainty in terms of what the true mean is if I take the fewer versus the more to get a better average with it. So when it comes down to trying to manage, if we're really trying to get the nitty gritty of it, manage down to the pound, it doesn't really work because there's so much uncertainty out there that really doesn't matter. So if you're dealing with something like one of your provinces up there where you've got a really large area, I mean, if they have data that, the soil's different in terms of how they react with phosphorus, I mean, then there might be something there. But that's kind of the issue. What I've seen is I don't make a lot of, when it comes down to it, I just give growers a range that I would target for most of their soils. And generally, they'll be okay. There might be some instances like Andrew was talking about that it might be worth looking at whether or not there might be some situations where you might need a higher level, but that's really where growers, if you can do it on your farm and look at it, it's really what I encourage doing because that's really about the only way you're going to know.
And it's much easier than it used to be. Does cation exchange capacity, CEC, does it make a difference, or how does it factor into our questions about phosphorus?
I think indirectly it might be useful because CEC is a rough proxy of clay content and organic matter content. Now, we hear about CEC for cation. There is a thing called AEC for anion exchange capacity, and that would be, phosphate is an anion. So if you think about the Piedmont region of the southeast U.S., those red soils, they have pretty high AEC, which applies to nitrate and to phosphate. It's why they have lower nitrate leaching in places like Brazil or Georgia, because there's lots of anion exchange. So CEC is just not that relevant to phosphate, right? Because it has a negative charge, so it's not going to bind to the cation exchange complex.
Okay. I like to learn at least one new thing per call. And so I think I've already got like 4. So far the show is a hit. Okay, so we have more than a few questions around phosphorus use efficiency, which is one of the things I think that is a question that farmers probably have or agronomists have without even asking it that directly. I think we're very familiar with nitrogen use efficiency. I think for the most part, we're better at understanding the loss mechanisms and trying to protect against the loss mechanisms for nitrogen. But sometimes with phosphorus, and Dan did a great job off the hop sort of explaining, there's always some there. We've got some legacy phosphorus there. We can build those reserves. But we also know that sometimes we add phosphorus and we don't always see a response. And maybe that does bring into question, the money spent on it, or what happens to it, or how we count on it later. So, Andrew, I'll go to you, and we've got some slides. Which of your slides do you want to start on? If we want to, I think it's slide. Let's start with slide 1, maybe. And
Sure.
You can explain this to me. So, producer Jay, if you would, there we go. Okay. How we calculate phosphorus use efficiency matters. What do you mean? Explain this chart to me.
Sure, yeah. So I don't want to get too technical here, but I think that your audience is intelligent. So I'm going to go
They
for
are.
a high level of detail. There's
Okay.
3 ways of getting at P use efficiency, 3 ways to calculate it. And the most common, the simplest way is by balance. You know what you added and you know what came off. So if you put on, 92 pounds of P2O5 per acre, and then you took off, 40 P2O5 per acre with grain harvest, then you can do the math. That's roughly like 50%, right? The problem is that this does not get at the soil contributions like legacy phosphorus, as Dan has pointed out. And so you typically get higher absolute values by the balance method. And this graph is showing you that if you look at all of the data published in scientific journals globally, going back to 1961 through 2013, that PUE by balance, which is that darker gray line on top, it's higher than PUE by difference. More on the difference in a second. But note that PUE exceeds 100%. So more P is in the grain than what was applied, which by definition means it had to have come from the soil.
Right.
So the second way of doing PUE is by difference. So you have a plot with phosphorus added, and then you got a plot that has no P added. And then you subtract the P in the grain or in the crop in the unfertilized plot from the P fertilized plot. The assumption being that, well, that 0 P plot, any P that's in the plant came from soil. So you can take that away and attribute what's left to the fertilizer in the plus P plot. So that one is a lot more common, and it's, I think, the standard for agronomy. But note on this chart that the values are a lot lower. Sometimes they're 5 times lower. And so this is a bit like the soil tests. Know the method because the absolute number isn't comparable across the methods of measurement.
Okay. So that makes sense. An excellent description. But yes, you're right. We have a very smart audience, so we can get into the weeds a little bit. Okay, so we know that then some phosphorus is going to come from the soil each year. We know that we can apply more phosphorus than maybe is needed because we're planning down the road. Let's say phosphorus prices were low, or we're just in a rotation where we can add more, etc. So we know that we can build that bank a little bit. We also know that if conditions are good and we have a decent pool to draw from, that might do well. The reverse is also true, right? And this is what I think a lot of farmers are asking of their agronomists is there a case for phosphorus levels in the soil that are high enough that you would apply no phosphorus fertility? Andrew, I'll ask you that one first. I asked Dan a version of that, but I would love to hear your answer, Andrew.
Short answer is yes. There's going to be a threshold either for yields, bushel per acre increase, or return, let's say, or net dollar return with the application. And there's a certain soil test P level above which either bushels or dollars don't make sense to apply more. That depends. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. And it depends on, I would argue, the field scale. That's where that 0 check strip makes sense. Right. For Illinois, we put it roughly around, there's not great data, and I agree with Dan here. If there's no great data, I'm not going to give a hard answer. But if you're over 80 ppm Melic 3 phosphorus, it would be surprising to see any yield response. So then it makes sense, especially in low grain price years, high input price years like this one, to not apply. It might also make sense to do that even when there might be a bushel increase, but not a net dollar per acre increase to adding more P. So these are plastic boundaries. I will say that one of the big questions on what we think of as drawdown, so we are applying under the rate of offtake with harvest, whether we're applying half of that or none of that, as you just pointed out. How to do that safely, how quickly can you draw down is an open question. There's lots of folks that I work with out here, farmers who will do 50% of maintenance just to ease into it. Some go cold turkey, 0% of maintenance. They just don't
Yeesh.
apply NP.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sitting at 150 ppm
Yep.
melic, frankly, and I've seen fields for 32 years, not a single application of phosphorus, and yields are just fine because their soil tests are above 80 ppm for 30 years.
Right.
So
And
it really does.
yeah. We do have a farmer from Western Canada, from the West Coast, I should say, so very, very far west. I don't think Kevin's on tonight, but he has a very small land base, dairy, and he has shared his phosphorus levels on this call at times, and it makes most of our eyes water. So definitely there are instances where you may just constantly be in drawdown mode. Jason Vogt out of Manitoba has got a great question. And so, Dan, I'll go to you on this one first. But are growers in Minnesota and Illinois building phosphorus in corn and other crops for the benefit of the following soybean crop? Or are they applying phosphorus to the current soybean crop and seeing any benefits? So, Dan, you're closest to Manitoba, so you get to answer first.
So that's an excellent question, because I'll put something out to a lot of our growers, and I'll get some pushback from it from the western part of the state. And the answer I'm going to give you, it depends. For the majority of our state, for our soils that we can build, the ones that were more problematic are our high pH soils. That, if you look at a lot of our data, it really doesn't matter. Just the thing I tell a lot of the growers is don't forget about the soybean crop. And if you're targeting what we deem as the critical level, or kind of that point at where yield is maximum, because it's one of the things actually that video had talked really, I think it's kind of the disservice we do a little bit. We talk a lot about critical levels when we talk about soil tests, or the point at which yield is at about 100%. That we don't talk about the probability of response as much. And that's kind of what your video was getting into, talking about the soil test classifications, right, and how they break into a probability of response model. So if you deal with a very low soil test, there's a very low probability the soil will have enough phosphorus to supply the crop, versus very high, that there's a very high probability. So we can actually fit numbers to that. And that's actually what we're trying to do with that. But if you're managing around that critical level, corn, soybeans, it's roughly the same for us, that you should be at about maximum yield potential. The big thing I tell a lot of the growers is not forget about soybeans. And the only situations, although we see more growers now doing more P and K, both potash and phosphate ahead of the soybean crop, that in most cases it doesn't really matter unless you have a situation where those nutrients are being, I wouldn't say really fixed, because anything is really never fixed, but it might be temporarily unavailable. So, that's kind of the situation where I think for us, most growers, really the high pH soils is where I would go directly ahead of it. And that's really it. Yeah. Just don't forget about the soybean crop. It's really the big thing, because that's one of the things I've been doing more with a lot of my research, is I've been looking at the full rotation instead of just a one and done situation, because, especially with some of these things, we don't always see the full economic benefit until you start looking at your rotation, particularly if you're applying for 1 year and trying to get multiple years benefits here in the future.
If you grow wheat in a corn soil rotation, everybody wants to tell you should look at three years of budgeting, because then the wheat makes sense. Anyway, wheat Pete's not here, so I have to say that. So Andrew, similar question. And so what is interesting, or what I will share, and I'm sure the two of you know this, but Manitoba would have more of that, exactly that calcium tie-up with the higher pHs. Ontario, we end up dipping into the low 6s, some places high 5s, and with lime to bring it back up to that 6.5, 6.8, somewhere in there. So definitely seeing sort of both sides of that. Dan, you have a very interesting job that you could deal with both of those. But Andrew, so similar question though, assuming in Illinois that they grow anything but corn, thinking about the soybeans that may come after, is there value in looking ahead to the soybean crop and fertilizing ahead of that crop, or is it meeting the need that year? Can you actually do that?
It's a good question. I don't think we've got great data on it, but I can say from some trials we've seen in the south of Illinois where there are more acidic soils. It's also a much milder climate. So compared to Manitoba, but even to Champaign or compared to Chicago, south of Illinois, that southern third, they have a more open spring window typically because it's a milder winter to
Right.
make more applications. And there I see a lot of guys doing in front of each crop each year. So in front of corn, in front of soybean. In fact, down there, they double crop wheat, soybean more than we do. So you put in
Yeah.
winter wheat, comes off in late June, then you put in soybean, shorter season, but you get more profit per acre for the double cropping. In those systems for double cropping, it is recommended to put on phosphorus in front of the soybean crop. The problem is that that window between the wheat and the soybean is critical to minimize because for every day after the wheat, you're going into July sometimes, the soybean yields really start to drag. So if you're double cropping, there is a need, but then there's less time to do it. And if you're full season soybean cropping, then if you've got the window like down south, then people put it in front of the soybean. A big issue there is that we tend to use MAP and DAP as our main P sources, and that extra nitrogen is not as useful to the soybean. So that's a good argument that I've seen for spread 2 years worth for the corn than the soybean as MAP or DAP, because then the corn can at least use more of that. Ideally, that's done in the spring. There's a good evidence that we're losing most of the MAP and DAP if we follow apply, if we have a warm and wet winter. So where you are, it's cold enough, it may not be a big issue.
And where Jason is, definitely cold enough. I'm from there, so I can say that. But that's Manitoba for you. Ontario, it depends where you are. It's pretty warm down in the south, but not up here. Anyway, okay, we have to take just a very quick break. Producer Jay, let's go to our last read of the night, and then we've got some cool use efficiency questions and a really great photo, Andrew, that we're going to share. But Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to our last read of the night. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are MNP, Black Earth, and the Soil School. Soil health directly impacts crop health, which directly impacts your bottom line. Real Ag Soil School provides an opportunity for farmers to learn how to improve soil through discussions in the use of cover crops, strip till and no-till, compost, manure, and more. The Soil School is made possible by support from the Mosaic Company. All right, so we have a few technical things I want to tackle. And then I want to hear about the Morrow plots, which for long-term plots is a fabulous name, regardless of who it's named after, because it's on the Morrow. Anyway, that's how I think about it. Okay, but first, let's go, Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to Andrew's slide 3. So back to this concept of fertilizer or phosphorus use efficiency and the method. So this is building off of the other slide we looked at. How do I read this? Because I see we've got some struvite on there, which Dan mentioned, some non-traditional sources. How should I interpret this?
Good question, Lyndsey. There's a lot going on here. You've shown the most complex slide that I have in my talks. So I'll begin with the sources maybe. So yeah, struvite is magnesium ammonium phosphate. It's a 528 and then 10 mag. It's been found to be quite beneficial for canola up in your territory because of the lower seed cost for canola. There's less salt damage from struvite compared to MAP or DAP. So even though the price per unit of P is higher for struvite compared to MAP or DAP, you save on the seeding costs. And then we've got MAP here. So we've got 3 soils shown by location of Champaign and Effingham, etc., and then just the soil type there. These are all black soils. They're mollisols. And they're all well above the critical value of 25 ppm. They're from 35 to 80 ppm. So these are typical for our neck of the woods in central Illinois. So with that said, actually one in the middle is not a mollisol. I misspoke. That's an alpha sol. So there's lower organic matter content. And the goal of this study was to understand if we take that PUE done by difference, so you've got a without P and then a with P. Everything else is the same, the nitrogen, the exact type of corn. And if you compare the difference method with the third method that I hinted at, but I didn't get into, we wanted to see if there's any discrepancies. So what's this third method? This is analogous to the world of nitrogen, where you can label the atoms of nitrogen in a form called a different isotope, and it just weighs a little bit more. But because in nature there's a certain kind of isotope that is more abundant than the minority one, if you enrich the minor version of it, then it's a very clear signal that you can trace. So for phosphorus, we only have one stable isotope. We have only two other options that are radioactive. They're unstable, and unstable atoms decay. This is the basis of nuclear everything. So the half-life is 25 days, unlike uranium, which is, 300,000 years.
Right.
So it's a pain to work with radioactive phosphorus because it's radioactive, right? We have to wear special shields and all this stuff. But the power is that we can label the atoms in the fertilizer and directly trace it into the crop. So we're not doing a difference calculation. We know for sure the P in the plant came from what we applied. So that's what we did here. On the left-hand side is PUE by difference. This is a classic approach of without P. On the right-hand side is with the isotopic approach. And what we're seeing here is the same exact pots, the same exact plants, everything is the same. The only difference is that we did for the same pots in the greenhouse, because it's radioactive, the isotope method calculation. So what I want to point out here is that if you look on the left-hand graph, this is PUE by difference. We find that for most of our soils, that by B7 corn, that we have a negative PU sufficiency, meaning the corn without any P took up more phosphorus into its biomass than the corn with phosphorus, which this is how it's a negative PUE, right? So mathematically, it's possible. Sorry, it is impossible in the real world, but mathematically, that's it. If we look then on the right-hand side, the same exact corn plants, but if we look at the source of the atoms of phosphorus in the corn plant, because we label them, we find that PUE is positive, as it should be, right? PUE can never be in the negative. So what this points out is that we're probably underestimating PU sufficiency by the difference method when we have soils with adequate soil test P levels. And I think the reason why is that our assumption that the amount of P in the without P plot compared to the with P plot is the same, that's incorrect. What it means is that when the corn has no P added, it will take up more from the soil than when it has P added. And that's how we get more P uptake without P input compared to P input, and hence the negative PUE by difference. So big picture, what this means is that I think in deficient soils, P deficient soils, the PUE by difference works just fine. But if we've got sufficient phosphorus, measuring our PUE of our fertilizer becomes challenging, and we get a lot of awkward negative values, which means that we're underestimating that the crop actually did use some of that fertilizer phosphorus.
Dan, when you look at something like this and think this through, is this also part where in soils that are, let's say, sufficient or have a medium or low to medium or something that you would consider a medium test value, where cutting those rates doesn't seem to impact yield too much right off the hop? Does that start to make sense then?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the probability of response, so if I'm already in the high to very high, essentially all I'm doing by applying phosphorus at that point is replacing what's being taken out. And, I've looked at replacement, or I've looked at removal versus maintenance. And, if we hit exact removal, my soil tests tend to increase. So it isn't always kind of where it'll hold at the same point anyway. So, we know that, that at that point, that's really all you're doing is just trying to maintain at that certain point, and that the crop really doesn't need it. And if you look at kind of what Andrew was saying, actually, if some of those growers easing into drawdown, that's kind of what I recommend a lot of our growers do if you're dealing with crops like corn. Or, if, you deal with a lot of growers out in Saskatchewan that have a lot of wheat on there, if you've got an air seeder, you can put down some banded P, you're probably just better off on that. And maybe you don't need as high of a rate. There's certain things that you can do, but it's not a one size fits all strategy. And the big thing is you get above a certain point. There's a range you want, I think, to target, not just a set point. So, a lot of our growers with the Bray will be 20 to 30. They'll kind of target in that range, somewhere within there. And the idea then is you've got kind of least a little bit of working range. Because the thing about the soil test that you have to be careful with is that while the general trends say I don't apply phosphorus so that my soil test will decrease over time, if you look at what that data looks like on a year-to-year basis, the soil test is going like this in the general. So it's not a steady decrease. It's kind of an up and down thing. That's where, you've got to look at your trends over time versus looking at 1 year versus the other, because you'll hit years sometimes where all growers all of a sudden freak out. It happens more with potassium than it does with phosphorus, that they'll take soil samples and they'll be really low, and then they apply to removal rate. And it kind of what tends to happen. So it's more of a marathon versus a sprint when it comes down to it. So the main thing, though, is just knowing that, and that's one of the things that a lot of people get hung up on removal. They get hung up on these exact values for how much phosphorus is in wheat or is in corn or canola, whatever the grain is, and that isn't a fixed number either. I mean, the number I give generally is kind of the median of this huge data set I have. But the thing it speaks to is, and I talked about this before, is what we call error, and essentially an uncertainty with our numbers that we can build in with a lot of our statistics to give us a range. We can give a grower a set value, but generally I like giving a range because, that's more realistic in terms of what we should be operating in with that. And as you kind of said, the higher the soil test, the better you should be. Although that's why you soil test, is then hopefully to kind of watch things that doesn't get below a certain point where you have issues.
Yeah. So, and Andrew, like I think about from crop uptake perspective. So here in Ontario, in the area I'm in, we had a very, very dry year. It didn't start out that way. We had good moisture till about June, and then the tap turned off. And so, in season from a plant perspective, it totally makes sense to me that with, lower rainfall or very dry conditions, you see, induced deficiencies potentially of certain nutrients. But from a soil test perspective, what can influence sort of the ranges that you're going to get? Is that just, let's assume, is it that I'm not taking them from the same places? Is it that crops are going to use it differently? What can account for some of the variability of P and K year to year in a soil test?
Gosh, I would say K might be more variable because of things like release from stover. If you pull a soil before you get a good rainfall after combining corn,
Yep.
you will see it lower than after it rains a couple inches and all that stover K just leaches out. So P is less than K in my experience, but you're right, it can still vary quite a bit. Dan's pointed out very well that there's uncertainties, right? These are not precise tools, and that's okay. It's cost effective because there's a trade-off of cost versus precision. So most soil testing labs are within 20% for the same sample. That's what they're certified to do. We could probably get 2%, but then the cost might triple, right? So there's this, I would be careful. The spatial variation matters quite a bit, as Dan has also pointed out. Temporally speaking, there might be more or less tie up as a function of moisture, as a function of how prolonged dryness it has been. That seems, I think, secondary though to just the crop phase, right? If you just took off a crop and you've been trying to use up that P, then that will bring down those levels. There was great data though that to Dan's point from Ohio State showing it's a total oscillation over time. And so I think if someone wants to really take stock, keeping records, this is hard to hear, right? But if you began 10 years ago with consistent soil testing, that might give you a bit more confidence. I would suggest this as you take the same soils and you send them to the same lab and call them different samples. See how much variation there is. And then if you go to different labs or even just sample on a finer grid than usual, so don't do a 5 acre, try a 1 acre for part of a field, and just get a feel for how variable it is on the soil lab end and on your field end. Just like that 0 P strip on your field, you will get a better sense. And the last thing that I'll say is that I don't really believe in soil test P to inform maintenance rates. I think it should be based on grain, but also grain testing. As Dan said, it is a distribution of values, and you're getting an average, or in our case of Illinois, the 75th percentile. So you have a higher offtake rate being assumed for 3 out of 4 fields to be safe. Measure your grain. We talk about testing soils a lot, but you can also test the grain for the P content. And if you were to grid sample your grain on a 10-acre grid, you would have a more accurate sense of what exactly is coming off with every bushel in that field.
Mm-hmm. Easier to do with, say, nitrogen in wheat because you could just use your protein map. Phosphorus, less easy. So, but that doesn't mean it can't be done, everybody. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we are nearing the end of our time, but we did start a few minutes late, so we still have a few more minutes if everybody is okay to stick around for just a little bit. There's a few things I want to go over. One, I'm going to apologize now. It seems that Jason Vogt is very excited to have the two of you up in Winnipeg in February to speak at a conference. I apologize profusely. It is Winnipeg in February. You don't have to say yes, but apparently he's saying that he'll take you ice fishing, and there may be hot cocoa involved. Anyway, you'll have to check the chat later. Okay, but producer Jay, if you could, I asked you to pull the one picture of Andrew in the Morrow plots. Do we have that picture? Because I think no, it's the Morrow ones. It's the one I sent separately. These are the other ones. It's soil sampling with an old-timey photo. Did you grab that
Oh,
one?
that one.
Yes. It was in a separate one. It was slide 4. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't.
Those, no.
Ah, crumb. Okay. We will have to share it maybe in the post or something. So, tell me, Andrew, about these Morrow plots. There are different long-term trials, long-term plots in different parts of North America, Europe, whatever. I didn't know much about the Morrow plots until I got to see some of these. So tell me, what are they, and what do you do there?
Sure. So I direct the Morrow plots, which is the world's second oldest continuous ag experiment. They were founded in 1876. They're second only to the English, to the Rothamsted study, which I believe is 1843. There's a big debate, but their wheat field began 1843. So the third oldest is the Sanborn experiment in Missouri. So for the Americas, the Morrow plots is the oldest continuous ag experiment. It began in 1876 to try to test the effects of crop rotation on corn yields. And in 1904, they split up these large rotation plots into subplots to assign fertility treatments. And these include never fertilize, which is how they began in 1876, and then different treatments that have changed over time in what we add, but the ethos, the spirit has been maintained. So we have a modern fertility. Today it's NPK. It used to be bone rock and steamed bone meal. And we have a manure-based plot. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the value of the Morrow plot is that we have kept detailed records since 1876, yield data and soil samples beginning in 1904, which is a great way to look at legacy phosphorus, but also all kinds of changes in soils that are pertinent to crop productivity.
Super cool. So everybody, check it out. Dan, are you super glad you don't have to do anything with bones? Because no thanks.
It's fertilizer. So,
I guess.
I probably worked with worse. So I haven't dealt with manure in a few years, and I haven't really regretted it. So.
Well, okay. So there you go. Okay. So super cool. Everyone, please check that out. I'm always fascinated by what we can learn from long-term plots. I know that there are not nearly as long-term, some in Canada, but we do have some pretty cool ones that are approaching several decades at least that have cover crops in rotation. Some of the long-term trials in Saskatchewan that Guy Lafon made happen and shepherded for many years. So cool to see just, so many years of data. It's really cool. So go check it out. Okay, now there's one last question, Dan, that I'll go to you on. When somebody in the chat, it escapes me right now, I think it was Reynold, mentioned, we talked a bit about phosphorus fixing. We can also talk about phosphorus liberation or mineralizing or trying to make it more available. This gets thrown around a lot, that buckwheat is magical. We've talked about it on the show before, that the science can't point to it, but there is something there. Do we have any tools in our toolbox that we have good data for that can help us make use of the phosphorus that's already in our soil?
Well, I think a lot of what we're seeing now is I've been getting more questions on, phosphatase, which is an enzyme that helps break down organic phosphorus. It's one of the things that's been kind of looked at in, there are some companies now putting that out as kind of like a biostimulant, but something similar to that. So, and
Similar. Yep.
And I mean, in terms of what we've been seeing with data, it's just not consistent enough where I've kind of looked at it. With manure, though, it is interesting. Kind of our manure specialist and, one of our other people here at the university that works with phosphorus talking a little bit about manure and situations where, looking at some of those enzymes in manure actually seemingly getting a little bit higher uptake. And, we always see kind of the magic of manure, which we get higher yields compared to some of their fertilizer plots that, maybe there's something with some of that. But with some of our mineral fertilizers right now, really, I don't really see a lot. And the question I have on a lot of this stuff too is, if you look at trying to unlock what's in the soil, we know that that's a finite amount at some point. So, the question is, how much can we physically unlock before we start getting into issues where we're depleting? Because one of the things that, we really don't want to completely deplete the soil, but we know that there's a lot there. I mean, some of your growers in Saskatchewan, we've got soils in northwest Minnesota where you can have, 1, 2, 3,000 part per million of total phosphorus. It's not all available. Not a lot of it's not available there, but there's a lot there. It's just not really available. So that's kind of the thing with phosphorus. I mean, there tends to be a lot there. It's just getting the availability. And the question is long term, is that going to be a strategy where we can count on where, I still think there's a place for fertilizer and manure and other amendments that we add back into, look at trying to balance things out a little bit better so we don't run into issues where we deplete the soil.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, there's the flip side of this too, and we haven't touched on it a lot in this episode, but we have before about loss mechanisms as well. And phosphorus obviously is one that we don't want entering our waterways or our streams in excessive amounts. We want it to stay where it is or where we put it for the crops to use. From that perspective, though, from the management perspective, what do we need to think about with phosphorus so that we are being environmentally conscious as well?
In terms of losses, Lyndsey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, MP movement. Yeah.
Well, great question. I think burying your phosphorus and not putting it on frozen ground is a pretty clear. We should not be doing that. I don't think most people are doing that, but that's a thing that we've come a long way on. Most of our phosphorus is lost with sediment. So to me, our phosphorus losses are largely a soil conservation challenge. I know erosion is not as sexy as soil health, which drives me nuts because you can't build soil health if it's all eroding. But a lot of the same practices that are being promulgated for soil health really began, let's say, as conservation practices. So to me, for phosphorus, yes, we do see pulses of dissolved phosphate if we apply DAP on frozen ground. I've seen it coming out of tiles here. But really, sediment is so full of phosphorus naturally. As Dan said, we have got high amounts. Here we have easily 20,000 pounds of P per acre to 3-foot depth in Illinois, in most that is naturally occurring phosphorus. Now, 1% is available, but if you're eroding a lot of soil, that's a pretty high load, and it takes a lot of fertilizer loss to begin to match that. So I would say number one is soil conservation. Number two is burying, whether it's subsurface banding, placing, or whether it's incorporating after application, is probably the next best thing.
Mm-hmm. Really good point. That we do have a lot of naturally occurring phosphorus, and so keep your topsoil is super, super valuable. Keep it in your field if you can. I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you both very much. And again, I apologize for getting you invited to Winnipeg. You don't have to say yes, and Jason can take it up with me later. But I do think you'd be fantastic speakers at the Crop Connect conference. So there you go. But Dan, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise. This was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Sure thing, Lyndsey. Thanks for having us.
All right. And as I mentioned, next week, we're going to talk about grain drying. So come on back, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here live on the Agronomists. Have a great week. Cheers, everybody.